The envelope was on the kitchen counter, propped against the coffee maker, which was the first thing Reed Calloway looked for every morning of his adult life, and which his wife had understood, and which she had used, because she understood him, to make sure he would not miss it. He had been in the air for 19 hours. Before that, 3 weeks in a forward operating location in northern Syria that he was not permitted to describe. Before that, 11 months of a deployment that had taken things from him he was still cataloging. He set his bag on the floor inside the door and looked at the envelope and understood what it was before he opened it. The way you understand certain things before they are confirmed. Because the house had the particular quality of a place that has been emptied of a presence rather than a person, and that quality was unmistakable to a man who had spent 14 years reading environments. He opened it. He read it. He set it back on the counter exactly where it had been. Then he noticed the back door was open. Not ajar. Open. The screen door was latched, but the interior door was standing wide, and the cold March air of Coronado, California was moving through the gap, and Reed walked through the kitchen and pushed the screen door open and stood on the back step and looked at the yard. And the yard was empty. The dog was gone. His name was Ranger, and he was a 5-year-old German Shepherd, 83 pounds, black and tan, with a scar across his left muzzle from a training incident in 2021 that had healed to a pale ridge that gave his face a permanently serious expression he had not required the scar to achieve. He had been with Reed for 4 years, through 2 deployments and a training rotation, and the long, difficult year that had preceded this one, when the marriage had been visibly failing in the way that marriages fail, when one person is gone more than they are present, and the other person has exhausted the reserves required to maintain something alone. Ranger had been there for that year. Ranger had been there for everything. Reed stood on the back step in his deployment clothes with the divorce papers on the counter behind him and the empty yard in front of him and the California morning around him, and he did not know yet that Ranger had been gone for 11 days, or where he had gone, or that a woman named Dorothea Wick, 71 years old, a retired school teacher on the far end of a street 2.5 miles from Reed's house, had been feeding him on her back porch every morning and evening, and had been looking for his owner with the patient, systematic determination of a woman who had spent 34 years finding things out when her students needed her to. He did not know any of that yet. He only knew the yard was empty and the back door had been open long enough for the cold to reach the kitchen, and that everything he had come home to was not what he had expected, and that the second fact was, in this moment, somehow easier to hold than the first. He went to find his dog. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story is reaching you tonight, please subscribe and stay until the very end. What Ranger led Reed to, 2.5 miles from everything he thought he'd lost, is something neither of them could have found alone. Reed Calloway was 39 years old and had the physical bearing of a man who had trained for sustained violence, and had sustained it, and had come out the other side still standing, which was not nothing, and which he was not always able to remember on the mornings it felt like nothing. He was 6'1", 195 pounds, with a lean, functional build that had very little extra in it, and a face that had been weathered by 14 years of sun and cold, and the particular compression of carrying serious things without showing them. His hair was dark and cut short, and his eyes were a pale, steady hazel that shifted between green and gray depending on the light, and that people consistently described as looking through things rather than at them. His jaw was clean-shaved, because he'd shaved on the plane, out of a habit so deeply ingrained he'd done it without deciding to. The preparation for returning to a life that had, in the time between takeoff and landing, changed into something he did not yet have a map for. He had been a Master Chief Petty Officer with SEAL Team 7. 9 deployments over 14 years. Afghanistan 4 times. Iraq twice. A maritime counterterrorism rotation in the Gulf. And 2 joint task force assignments in locations his security clearance still prevented him from naming in any document. He had a Bronze Star with Valor device and a Purple Heart from a vehicle ambush in Kandahar in 2012 that had cost him 3 weeks in Landstuhl and a piece of his left calf muscle that the surgeons had managed to minimize but not eliminate, and that he no longer thought about on anything except very cold mornings. He had been married for 7 years to a woman named Dana, who had been, by every measure he had available, a good person who had made a reasonable decision about her own life after making an unreasonable number of accommodations to his. He understood this. He had understood it since the Kandahar hospital, when she had flown to Germany and sat beside his bed for 9 days, and he had watched her face during those 9 days and known that she was at the limit of what she could give to something that kept asking. He had re-enlisted anyway. He had told himself she understood. She had understood, and it had not been enough. And neither of those things was a simple fact, and he had spent 14 months of this final deployment not thinking about them very carefully. He was thinking about them now. He went door to door on his street first, which produced 3 people who had seen Ranger at various points over the past week and a half. Mrs. Hernandez at the corner had put out water for him on day 3. An older man named Fowler 2 doors down had seen him moving east along the street early one morning, but hadn't been close enough to read the tags. And from this he constructed a general direction and began walking. He had a photo on his phone from 8 months ago, the last one he had before the deployment. Ranger at the edge of the backyard looking over his shoulder at the camera, with the intelligent, slightly impatient expression of a dog who is tolerating being photographed, because the person with the phone is the person whose business is his business. He showed the photo at a convenience store, and at a dry cleaner, and at a small park where 2 women were walking a terrier, and the second woman said she'd seen a big German shepherd twice this week, moving along the path that ran behind the residential blocks on the east side. He followed the path east. Ranger was on Dorothea Wick's back porch when Reed came around the corner of her fence. And he saw the dog before the dog saw him, which was rare, and he used the 3 seconds of it to look at Ranger with the specific relief of a person who has been maintaining a controlled exterior and is now, for a moment, not required to. Ranger was lying on a folded moving blanket on the porch with a ceramic bowl beside him and his chin on his paws, and his eyes tracking the yard with the proprietary attention of a dog who has assessed a situation and decided it is his to supervise. His coat was clean. His ribs were not showing the way Reed had feared they might be. He had, visibly and completely, been looked after. Then Ranger's head came up. His ears went forward. He was off the porch in 3 seconds, moving across the yard with the low, purposeful run of a dog who is not performing enthusiasm but expressing something that does not have a lesser word than joy. And he hit Reed at the knees, and Reed went down on one knee on the cold ground and put both hands in the thick fur along Ranger's neck and held on. And the dog pressed his head against Reed's chest and held still. The specific stillness of a dog who has been waiting and has now received the information that the waiting is finished. He was still on his knee when the back door opened. Dorothea Wick was 71 years old and had the posture of a woman who had stood in front of classrooms for 3 decades and had never fully relinquished the authority that posture conferred. She was small, 5'3", with silver hair cut practically short and dark eyes behind wire-framed glasses that assessed Reed with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who has evaluated a great many people over a long career and is capable of forming an accurate impression in a short time. She was wearing a cardigan over a collared shirt and had a dish towel over her shoulder, and she stood in her doorway and looked at Reed on the ground with his arms around Ranger, and she did not say anything for a moment. "You're the owner," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Reed said. He was standing by then. "He's been here 11 days. I was overseas. I just got back this morning." She looked at him in a way that took in the deployment clothes and the bag-heavy eyes and something else, he wasn't sure what, but she was a woman who had spent 34 years reading rooms full of young people, and she knew what a person looked like when they had arrived at a hard morning. She stepped back from the door. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He did not mean to stay more than 20 minutes. He stayed 2.5 hours. Dorothea Wick had taught 5th grade at an elementary school in Coronado for 34 years, had retired at 67, had lost her husband Gerald to a stroke 4 years ago, and lived alone in the house they had bought together in 1987, with the particular self-sufficiency of a woman who had always been her own most reliable resource. She had a daughter in Portland she spoke to every Sunday, and a son in Austin she spoke to slightly less often, and 3 grandchildren she drove to see twice a year. She kept a garden. She read every evening and had opinions about what she read that she did not keep to herself when asked. She had found Ranger on a Wednesday morning standing at the edge of her backyard looking at her vegetable beds with an expression she described to Reed as evaluative, and she had understood immediately that he was not a feral dog, and not a dangerous one, and not a dog who belonged where he was. And she had done what 34 years in a classroom had trained her to do, with things that were lost and capable of more than their circumstances suggested. She had provided the conditions for them to stabilize while she worked on returning them to where they belonged. She had called the number on his tags twice. Both times it had gone to voicemail with an outgoing message that said the mailbox was full. She had filed a found dog report with the Coronado Animal Services office. She had posted in 3 neighborhood groups online with the photo she had taken of Ranger on the 2nd day. She had done all of this with the systematic persistence of a woman who does not accept the non-resolution of things that are resolvable, and who had, at the point of Reed's arrival, been about to escalate to calling the address's property records directly. Reed listened to this and understood that an elderly woman had done more to find him in 11 days than the infrastructure designed for exactly that purpose had managed. He told her this. She said that the infrastructure was poorly organized and that this was a general problem and not specific to this situation. He told her about the deployment, not all of it. The classified portions remained classified regardless of the quality of the coffee, which was very good, but the shape of it, the length of it, the places, the nature of the work. She listened with the attentiveness of someone who has made a professional practice of it. She asked 2 questions, both of which were exactly the right questions, and did not ask any of the wrong ones, which was rarer than it should have been in his experience of civilian conversations about his work. He did not tell her about the papers on the counter. He did not tell her about the empty house or the quality of the quiet in it, or the fact that he had spent 19 hours on a plane constructing an arrival and was now navigating a different one. He did not need to tell her. She was 71 and had been a school teacher and had lost her husband, and she had read rooms for 3 decades, and when he stood to leave and said he was grateful, she said what she said. "You can come back," she said. It was not a social formula. "For dinner, if you'd like. I cook for 2 by habit, and I've never been able to break it." He came back on Friday. He came back the following Tuesday. By April, it was twice a week. Tuesday dinners and Saturday mornings, when Dorothea gardened and Reed cleared the beds she couldn't reach, and Ranger patrolled the yard's perimeter with the proprietary thoroughness of a dog who has claimed a territory and takes the claims seriously. They talked about the garden and about the books she was reading, and about Gerald. who had been a civil engineer and a quietly funny man, and who Dorothea discussed with the clear-eyed candor of someone who has completed grief's acute phase and arrived at the place where the person can be spoken about as fully as they lived. She asked Reed questions about his life, with the direct curiosity of a woman who finds people genuinely interesting and does not pretend otherwise. He answered them more completely than he had answered similar questions from people who had known him longer. He was not sure why this was true, and eventually stopped trying to determine why, and simply allowed it. In May, Dorothea's daughter called on a Sunday evening while Reed was there for a dinner that had extended well past dinner into a conversation about a book Dorothea had given him the week before. And Dorothea stepped into the other room to take the call, and Reed sat at the kitchen table with Ranger at his feet and looked at the room. The photographs on the refrigerator, the shelf of teaching awards, the garden visible through the window in the last of the evening light, and felt something that he took some time to identify correctly. It was not complicated once he had named it. It was the sensation of being in the right place. Not the place he had expected to be, or the place he had planned for, or the place that the life he had built and then watched alter itself had been directed toward. Simply the right place, on this Tuesday in May, in a kitchen that smelled of the dinner and the garden and the particular warmth of a house that has been lived in by people who treated it carefully. Ranger put his chin on Reed's foot and sighed. A long, settling exhalation, the sound of a dog who has also reached a conclusion. The divorce was finalized in July. Reed had gotten an attorney recommended by the base legal office, and the process had been, given the circumstances, straightforward. No children, no significant contested property. Two people who had treated each other with more decency in the ending than circumstances required. Dana had called him once during the process, and they had spoken for 40 minutes in the specific tone of two people who know each other well and have decided not to be enemies. And when the call ended, Reed had felt something he had not anticipated. Not grief. Or not only grief, but the particular clarity of a door that has been properly closed. He had gone to Dorothea's the following Saturday and told her it was done, and she had nodded and said she was sorry. And then she had handed him a trowel and told him the back bed needed turning, and they had worked the garden for an hour without speaking about it further, which was exactly what he had needed, and which she had known without being told. In September, the daughter visited from Portland. Her name was Anna, and she was 44, and she had her mother's directness and a laugh that arrived without warning and stayed a while. She had heard about Reed from Dorothea over 4 months of Sunday calls, and had formed, she told him on the second evening, a fairly complete picture that she now found somewhat inadequate given the actual person. He said he hoped the actual person was an improvement. She said the jury was still out, but she was cautiously optimistic. Dorothea watched this exchange from the other end of the table with the expression of a woman observing something she has been expecting and finds satisfactory. Ranger, who was lying at the edge of the dining room, raised his head during this exchange, looked at Anna, looked at Reed, and put his chin back down. His tail swept the floor twice. Then he was still. By November, Reed had begun the paperwork for a position with a veterans transition program based in San Diego that trained former service members as first responders, a role that Dorothea had found in a job listing 2 months prior, and had mentioned to him in the specific way she mentioned things she considered relevant, which was directly and once and without further pressure. He had applied. He had been offered an interview. He had sat at Dorothea's kitchen table to prepare for it, and she had conducted a practice interview with him with the focused precision of a woman who had been preparing young people for difficult evaluations for 34 years, and at the end she had told him he was ready, and he had believed her, which was an experience he had not had with that particular sentence in longer than he wanted to calculate. The back door of Dorothea's house did not have a lock that had ever given Ranger difficulty. This had been established on day 2 of his residency there, when she had come downstairs to find him already in the kitchen, sitting beside the back door with the patient composure of a dog who has made a decision about a threshold and considers the matter resolved. She had bought a stronger latch in the 3rd week. Ranger had not tested it since. He had not needed to. By then, the door was open to him freely, which had always been the point. Reed understood, in the way he understood things that took time to see clearly, that the dog had known something he hadn't. That the open back door on that March morning, his wife's negligence or intention, or the indifference of a house being vacated, he had never determined which, had not been a second loss added to the first, but the beginning of a direction. Ranger had gone somewhere. He had stayed somewhere. He had been waiting on a porch he had decided was safe. And when Reed had followed the path east, dog-eared photo in his hand, asking strangers if they'd seen a big German shepherd moving this way, he had been following something that had already arrived at its destination and was waiting for him to catch up. He thought about that sometimes in the evenings on Dorothea's porch, with the California November going gentle around them, and Ranger at the steps, and the neighborhood quiet, and the lights coming on in the houses along the street. He thought about the quality of the guidance that had been available to him all along, if he had known how to follow it. He thought about the morning he had stood on the back step with the divorce papers on the counter and the empty yard in front of him, and believed, in the way that men believe things in their hardest mornings, that what was gone was simply gone. It was not simply gone. It had moved 2.5 miles east and was waiting on a porch, and all he had to do was go find it. Sometimes the best things in our lives are led to us by the ones who love us most purely. Not our plans, not our preparations, not the lives we built with careful intention and watched come apart in ways we couldn't prevent. But a German shepherd on a back step, looking east, deciding that east is the direction, and that the person who belongs to him will follow if he goes there first. God does not always fix what is broken. Sometimes he leads us, through the creatures who know us without our armor, toward something we couldn't have found alone. Toward a porch light 2.5 miles from everything we lost. Toward a woman who cooks for 2 by habit and has never broken it. Toward the room that feels, in the specific and irreplaceable way that right rooms do, like the one we were always meant to walk into. If you are navigating a morning that looks like nothing is left, pay attention to what your dog is doing. They have already done the calculation. They are waiting for you to follow. If Reed's story moved you tonight, share it with someone who is standing at a door they didn't expect to open. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if you have ever followed something you couldn't explain toward something better than you'd planned. We want to hear that story. It may be the one someone else needs tonight. If you believe in loyalty, in second chances, and in the grace that moves through ordinary creatures and ordinary mornings, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. May God bless you, protect your family, and remind you always that what is worth finding has a way of making sure you find it.